So for the second section of notes, we are going to be talking about the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is another important time period that is going to be great of developing new ideas, where the scientific revolution was focusing on science and math and those fields. The Enlightenment is going to focus on the fields of politics, economics, religion. So we're going to see more ideas develop within this time period. And that was very much spurred on by the ideas that had happened in the scientific revolution. So let's talk about what the Enlightenment was under EQ number 1. So the first thing is we want to define a term that's on the screen, philosophes, that you see underlined there, philosophes. And philosophes is just another way of saying the term philosophers, which are people that kind of think about the world around us. So philosophes or philosophers of the 1700s were impressed with the achievements of the scientific revolution. Impressed with the achievements of the scientific revolution. So they very much saw what the scientific, thinkers of that time were doing, and they thought, that's interesting. Maybe we can be using some of those same methods. The second bullet, so where this kind of all started, we want to say the early philosophes were French, and then many of them had professions that are listed there at the bottom of the screen, including French writers, professors, economists, and social reformers. So the early philosophers were a lot of the intellectuals of that time period, and the Enlightenment is really going to stem from France, but expand throughout Europe, as well as later to other parts of the world. And how this all kind of came about was what kind of defines this time period. So if we're talking about the Enlightenment, we would define it as the Enlightenment. This is our third bullet. The Enlightenment was the time period of great philosophical thinkers, Philosophical, great philosophical thinkers, using rational thinking, to present new ideas, in politics, economics, and religion. And so that leads us to looking at this concept of rational thinking. What is that? Because that was an important aspect of this time period and how many of these kind of new ideas came about. So under EQ2, we want to explain this by saying that Enlightenment philosophers applied the use of the scientific method applied the use of the scientific method to understanding all matters of life. To understanding all matters of life. Then put a semicolon. And we want to say this concept is known as rational thinking. This concept is known as rational thinking. And I would maybe highlight or underline that term for yourself. And then we also want to say, or the use of reason, which is another way of saying rational thinking, or the use of reason. So rational thinking is where we have Enlightenment philosophers taking the same kind of principles that are used in the scientific method of kind of, gathering data and information to kind of solve problems and come to a conclusion or an answer about something. So if you're looking at the chart up there, it's pulling in on all kinds of different areas, whether it be personal experience, gathered opinions, using other people as resources, facts, data. So all of those things together, you kind of weigh them and use what we call our reasoning skills, which is basically another way of saying rational thinking, to then develop a conclusion about some type of problem or question that we have. And so this is an idea that they developed during this time of how they could better kind of describe what was going on in the world around them. One of the main people that is kind of considered a modern rationalist is Rene Descartes. So for the second bullet, we want to write his name, Rene Descartes. And we want to say that he is the father of modern rationalism. The father of modern rationalism, which is just rational with ISM at the end of it. So he's kind of one of the people that is credited with even developing this idea or defining the concept of rational thinking or reasoning. And very famously, Descartes made the quote, "I think, therefore I am," which I want you to write down for your third bullet, that quote that's on the screen, "I think, therefore I am." And what this quote means, you can put a little dash after it, is we could say that it's his quote explaining how he only believed things that made sense to him. He only believed things that made sense to him. So Descartes, by saying "I think, therefore I am," is trying to kind of explain that he is going to use his own reasoning skills to make decisions in life. And so if someone's telling him, that he should believe X, Y, or Z, if X, Y, or Z doesn't make sense to him, then it's not a sound argument. And that was kind of his theory and his idea. And that's generally the concept of rational thinking. And it fits very much with that humanist thought that we've been talking about before, which is that it wants people to think for themselves and not just take information and ideas from people without kind of rationalizing them for yourself. So now let's talk about some of the new ideas that are developed during this time. So we're going to start with the area where we see the greatest growth, which is these new political ideas of this time period. Now, if you think about Europe in this time, most governments in Europe were monarchies at this time, pretty much exclusively monarchies. So the government model was always set up where the people have very limited rights and that one particular individual maintains all of the power and control over its, citizens or subjects. And what we see in this time period is a lot of these individuals starting to kind of question that model of a monarchy and whether that's actually the best type of government. So you'll see that as kind of an underlying theme here of a lot of these political ideas. So let's talk about these individuals and what kind of things they presented. So under EQ3, the first individual we're going to talk about is Thomas Hobbes. So we want to write his name down, Thomas Hobbes. And then we're going to talk about some of the different ideas that he presented. So the first idea that he said is he said that the natural rights of each individual, should be guaranteed. Natural rights of each individual should be guaranteed. And basically what that is saying is that he believed that every individual has certain freedoms, certain rights that every person is kind of entitled to. Now, he didn't define what those natural rights were yet. However, he does present the idea that there are certain things that we as individuals are kind of entitled to as humans. So he kind of ambiguously defines that concept. So let's put a semicolon and let's talk about the next thing that he presents. So the next idea is he said that political power must be representative. Political power must be representative. And what that concept is saying is that when we say political power must be representative, we're saying that the power that we have from our government should be something that is kind of representative of the people. Now, in that time, would a monarch, would they really have been someone that was representing the everyday, farmer or individual? No, not really. And so what's interesting is he's kind of presenting the idea of fitting with our system of the concept of voting, where we choose our representatives, our senators, our president, and that political power is kind of should be representative of the people's wants and needs. So he's presenting that concept. Third thing that he presents is he says that people are naturally selfish and in conflict. People are naturally selfish and in conflict, comma, so laws and other social controls are necessary. So laws and other social controls are necessary. So Hobbes would be what we would consider kind of a pessimist. He was looking at the glass half empty kind of idea. And he believed that people, just by genuine kind of character, are not good people, that we have very selfish needs and that we think about ourselves before we think about others, and that we are constantly would be in conflict or fighting with each other if there was no such thing as law and order. And so that's kind of what he presents, is that our society needs some type of law and order in order to control the people. So that we need police and court systems and prisons, or all those types of kind of institutions that our system uses in order to properly structure society and keep everyone safe. So those are the three ideas that Thomas Hobbes presents. Now let's talk about another Enlightenment thinker named John Locke. So let's talk about some of the ideas that John Locke presents. So the first one is kind of a broader idea that was a very guiding principle for him. So for this, we want to say that every person was born with a tabula rasa. Was born with a tabula rasa, which is up on the screen there for you, and it's underlined. So I would do the same in your notes. A tabula rasa, which is a Latin phrase, and it means blank slate. So a tabula rasa, or a blank slate. And then after that, we want to say, and that people are molded by their experiences. And that people are molded by their experiences. Put a comma. We want to say, therefore, a positive environment for people, would create a better society, or utopia, as it's commonly called, like a perfect society, which is there at the bottom part of your screen, or utopia. So Locke is going to present this concept that he calls a tabula rasa. And what he basically argues is that as a society and as humans, each of us, when we are born pretty much like a blank canvas, that we have no memories, no preconceptions, nothing. And that through our experiences, through daily living, through interactions with different people in our lives, those experiences each kind of molds us into the person that we become. That's why, for some of you maybe have had similar experiences in your life to others, and as a result, you are like-minded individuals. But then others have maybe had different experiences, and that has changed their perspective or their ideas about different things, and gives them different opinions. And even as you get older, you'll develop or change or evolve your kind of opinions as you mature. So Locke was kind of arguing that concept, and then he justified by saying that if we try and provide opportunities or try and create a positive environment for people to live in and structure society in a way that is positive for them, then in turn we'll be able to create a better society as a whole. So where Hobbes was more of a pessimist, Locke is kind of an optimist. He's a glass half full kind of person. And he was arguing that this was kind of the rationale. So we need to create the best possible society and government we can in order to make kind of the perfect world as he saw it, or a utopia. So that's one of his big ideas. Another big idea of Locke's So this is our second kind of thing. You can put a semicolon after utopia. We want to say a government's purpose is to protect people's natural rights, to life, comma, liberty, comma, and property. So where Hobbes kind of introduces the basic idea of a natural right as an individual, Locke is going to take this idea and he's going to extend it. He's going to say that we as individuals, yes, we are entitled to certain natural rights, and he defines those rights as the right to life, the right to liberty or freedoms, and the right to property. And he says that a government, its purpose, why it's necessary in society, is to basically protect those rights of us as individuals and as people. So he kind of further extends that idea. And then the third idea that Locke presents is he says that people enter into a social contract, as he called it. People enter into a social contract with their government, comma, and that there is no divine, D-I-V-I-N-E, that there is no divine right to rule. No divine right to rule. So Locke argues that we as individuals, our relationship with our government is what they call a social contract. Basically, it's something that both parties have to agree to the conditions of. And he says that as a result, because we have to agree to our type of rule, that just having what's called divine right, which means that many monarchs back then believed that the reason they were the monarch was because God had selected them to rule. And Locke basically says that's not true. That is not enough to rule your people. You need the people's consent, and that they should select that individual. So further kind of building on some of these ideas that we see. So that's John Locke and his ideas. So examples of divine right and natural rights. Now, the third individual we're going to talk about is Baron de Montesquieu. So Montesquieu is our third person. And for Montesquieu, the first thing that we want to say that was one of his ideas is the concept that too much power, as in T-O-O, too much power in any one person's hands, will lead to tyranny. And tyranny is T-Y-R-A-N-N-Y, will lead to tyranny. And so his kind of foundational idea was that he believed if you only have one singular ruler, that individual will be corrupted by having the sole power over everything. That leads to what he calls tyranny, which is basically the idea that corrupt practices will occur. And so his solution to that is kind of his second idea that we're going to introduce here. So you can put a semicolon after tyranny. And this idea is that three branches of government. Three branches of government. And those three branches that he argues for are, you want to put these in parentheses, the legislative, it's up on the screen there for you. Legislative, comma. Next one is judicial. Judicial, comma. And then the third one is the executive. Executive. Then close your parentheses. And we want to say with separation of powers, which that phrase is up on the top of the screen for you, with separation of powers between the branches, using checks and balances. Using checks and balances. So Montesquieu says in order to prevent tyranny and having, a monarch, instead what you should do is take your government and divide it into three groupings, each grouping overseeing a different area of government and having different responsibilities, and that each of those branches or groups will have certain powers, what we say is separation of powers, so different responsibilities, but that some of those powers will allow for them to kind of check on and make sure that no one other part has more power. We call that checks and balances. Now, hopefully this particular system should sound slightly familiar to you because this is the system that we use here in our government. So we have a legislative branch that includes our Congress. So that would be the Senate and the House of Representatives, where the legislative branch is kind of responsible for making our laws. And then we have what's called our executive branch, and our executive branch consists of the president as well as also the cabinet members that he selects, that they oversee different departments: Department of Defense, Department of State, Department of Interior, et cetera, Department of Education, and that they are overseeing different areas of kind of the infrastructure of our society. And then the third branch is our judicial branch, which is our court system. The highest court in the judicial branch is the Supreme Court, but then there's also court systems at smaller, more state and local levels that all kind of feed into that larger court system. And so Montesquieu kind of presented this idea, which is a model that we ourselves use here in our country. So we can see how this concept was something that was carried over later. All right, that leads us to our fourth individual, which is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And Rousseau is going to present a concept that he calls his social contract. So we want to say a social contract said liberty is achieved by following the laws of what is best for the general population. Following the laws for what is best for the general population. So this idea is similar to kind of what Locke was presenting when he talked about a social contract, which is the idea that the people have to kind of enter into an agreement with their government in order to be ruled. And Rousseau was kind of building on that and saying that basically the way that we have liberty and freedoms is by establishing laws that are going to be what is best for kind of society as a whole. So that's where when laws are created in different societies, they are done so in a way where they are trying to protect the rights of kind of the masses as a whole, and that they're doing what's best for the people in general. And so that is kind of his idea of how laws should work and how government should do everything it possibly can to protect our freedoms that are established by having those laws. And so that leads us to then Caesar Basileia. And so Basileia, his concept that he's going to argue for is he's going to first say that um, laws exist laws exist to preserve society. Laws exist to preserve society. So that we need law and order in order to preserve society, similar to some of the ideas that have been presented by some of our other thinkers. And then for his second idea, he's going to address the concept of punishment. So he's going to say punishments should not be brutal, or torture, comma, and capital punishment should not be used. And capital punishment, what that phrase means, some of you maybe heard of that before. Capital punishment is another way of saying the term death penalty. So Basileia was one that was against the concept of having a death penalty, that people should be executed for their crimes. Now, if you think about that time period, many of the punishments of that time were very torturous and violent. We've talked about things like burning at the stake, people being stoned, all kinds of different things. There was a very famous punishment of that time period that was called breaking on the wheel, where basically they would take a big wooden slab that was cut like a wheel and they'd strap people to it and basically tie them around the wheel at their wrists and then ankles, and then they take the wheel, and the wheel kind of had a big axle in the back, and they would wrap the ropes that were attached to your wrists and ankles around that, and then they'd start to twist the wheel, and as the ropes got tighter and tighter around the axle, basically what would happen is you'd be ripped limb from limb, and that was a punishment that they had. So very kind of extreme punishments of the time, and Basileia said those types of things are unnecessary and totally inappropriate for a modern kind of civilized society. So he started to kind of argue that those types of things needed to go away, including any type of, execution or death penalty. So that was a big concept that he argued for. And then the third thing that he argued for is he said a person accused of a crime should have a fair and speedy trial. Should have a fair and speedy trial. So he says that if you are charged with a crime, that you should have a fair trial and a speedy trial to determine your guilt or innocence. That basically one individual, like the monarch, should not have total decision over your fate, but rather that we should have some type of trial where, evidence can be presented and things like that. So he was presenting that idea that would also be important later on. So now let's look at some economic ideas. And the main economic individual we're going to discuss here is Adam Smith. So we want to write about him here for EQ4, Adam Smith. And his concept that he introduces is a concept that he calls laissez-faire, which you've probably heard before in US 1, laissez-faire. So we want to write that term down. It's up there on the screen in the blue box for you. And what this means, we want to define it as saying that the government should not interfere, INTERFERE, should not interfere with business or the economy. Should not interfere with business or the economy. So Smith is going to argue that basically we should have laissez-faire is another way of saying like a hands-off government, that the government should not mess with the kind of things that are happening in businesses and in the economy, that those are two separate entities. You might remember learning about this last year during US History 1, because this was an idea that was also very popular amongst a lot of entrepreneurs and business people of the industrial age, because it allowed for them to kind of say that they didn't want the government doing things like making child labor laws or working conditions or safety conditions, and being able to tell businesses that they had to follow those certain regulations or laws. And so laissez-faire, while it has some positives because it allows for businesses to really grow and thrive, it also has some negatives because it means that those businesses kind of have carte blanche or total free will to do whatever they want within the confines of their business, which isn't always best for the worker or the people. So Smith was the first to kind of advocate for this idea. Now he does say this kind of second idea here, where he said that he believed that government should pay for public works projects. Should pay for public works projects. So what that simply means is that things that are within society that would benefit the whole of society, the government should be responsible for financing those types of things. So roads, libraries, schools, etc., things that are going to reach the broader base of society should be financed by the government. All right, so that was some economic ideas by Smith. And then the last group of ideas we're going to talk about are some religious ideas. Now, the first person we're going to talk about is Voltaire. And Voltaire, his first idea is he pushed for the ideas of freedom of religion and speech. Pushed for the ideas of freedom of religion and speech. So if you think about that time period, we talked about how most people in their countries or in their societies would practice the same religion as their ruler, as their monarch. And Voltaire said that people should be able to practice whatever religion they want to, and they should also be able to share information freely with each other and have discourse, because oftentimes we've discussed this before, that groups like the Catholic Church would try and squash people presenting ideas that were different than their own, or monarchs would do the same type of thing if you were speaking about something that they didn't like. Voltaire said we should be able to have those freedoms, and they should also be kind of within our natural rights that we are entitled to. So, freedom of speech and religion. The second idea that he presents is a religious concept that he calls deism. So, let's write that term next, deism. Now, maybe underline it for yourself. And deism is a philosophy based on religion and reason. Philosophy based on religion and reason, saying God created the universe. God created the universe and then left it on its own. Without interference. Without interference, which is INTERFERENCE. Without interference. So Voltaire's idea about religion is he said that while he agreed that God was, creating man and the world and all of those kind of aspects of creation and that theory, he says that after God created man and everything, that God basically just left and is not kind of controlling things as a greater power, and rather that we as humans have control over our own lives and kind of what's happening to us. So this was a very kind of different attitude and a very unique religious idea that challenged especially the Catholic Church as well as the Protestant Church. So this was a really unique idea, and obviously Voltaire in this time got a lot of kind of heat and flack for this concept. The last person we're going to mention of new religious ideas is John Wesley. John Wesley. And so the first thing that we want to say about Wesley is that he started a movement called Methodism, which is up on the screen for you. Started a movement called Methodism, or the Methodist Church, as it's also commonly known. Methodism, or the Methodist Church, which was one of the dominant Protestant sects, in the American colonies. So Wesley is going to create the Methodist Church, which is still actually a very popular Protestant sect and church within American society today, as well as in some other parts of the world. And now what's unique is some of the concepts and ideas that Wesley was presenting. So for after colonies, put a semicolon, and we want to say this faith preached salvation through good works. This faith preached salvation through good works, comma, was one of the first to want to abolish, ISH, first, to want to abolish slavery, comma, and advocated, ADVOCATED, and advocated for prison reforms. And advocated for prison reforms. So this particular Protestant church was kind of different from some of the other Protestant churches. For example, if you think about what we learned about Martin Luther last unit, Luther very strongly believed that salvation came solely through, the Bible and from God, where Methodists believe that their faith was reinforcing the concept of salvation by doing good things, good practices in everyday life. And that they believed that, treating others with, respect and character and things like that. So that was another reason why they wanted to get rid of slavery. They didn't like that concept. And they also didn't like the idea of the mistreatment of prisoners and people. They saw everyone as kind of a fair equal in society. So this was definitely a new religion and a different religion in that time period, and a new kind of choice for individuals, and something that's going to spread to the colonies as well. So now let's talk about how those Enlightenment ideas are going to spread throughout Europe as well as to the American colonies. So for EQ number 6, the first thing we want to reference is our old friend, the printing press, because that's definitely going to be helpful. So for the first bullet, we want to say, with the use of the printing press, an increase in newspapers and magazines. An increase in newspapers and magazines help spread ideas of the Enlightenment. Help spread ideas of the Enlightenment. So people started to take their writings and their ideas and put them down on paper, and then reproduce them into very kind of short, what we would call newspapers of that time, as well as magazines. Now, magazines, when we say that term, we think of like the glossy, nice magazines that you buy. But magazines in that time period were more almost kind of like little pamphlets, where they were short informational texts that people could read and learn about some type of new concept. So a lot of those newspapers and magazines were filled with these Enlightenment ideas and started to circulate, especially around Europe. The second way that people were sharing these ideas was just in conversation. And so people started to gather in what they called salons to share these ideas. So for the second bullet, we want to say people also gathered in salons. That's that term, so you might want to underline it for yourself. And salons is just a fancy word for basically kind of like a living room in people's homes. So you might want to, in parentheses, write living room in people's homes. And then close your parentheses. And we want to say to discuss philosophical ideas. To discuss philosophical ideas. So it was more common back then where people would open their homes to a lot of different individuals, and they would come in and they would share information and kind of have these conversations, and that then through that means people would hear these new ideas and then maybe go on to share them with someone else and someone else, and so on and so forth. So just by kind of word of mouth, we also see people spreading these ideas. So then from there, we're going to see people take those ideas and spread them even further to some of the political thinkers that were within the colonies. So for the third bullet, we want to say many of the political ideas of the Enlightenment, many of the political ideas of the Enlightenment were carried to the political thinkers in the colonies. Were carried to the political thinkers in the colonies. Now, at that time, there was kind of a conflict going on in the colonies. So we had the colonies themselves, which were part of kind of British possession. But then there also were parts of the colonies that were French possessions. And right above the colonies is the land that is, back then it was New France. Today we know it as Canada. And that territory was dominantly French. And there was conflict over kind of France encroaching further on kind of these British colonies. And that would create a conflict that was referred to as the French and Indian War. So for the fourth bullet, we want to kind of briefly mention this because that's going to be an important conflict that's going to lead to these Enlightenment ideas becoming more kind of steadfast in that time. So we want to say for our fourth bullet, during this time period, conflicts between European powers like in the French and Indian War, which is up on the screen for you. European powers like in the French and Indian War were occurring between France and England in North America. Were occurring between France and England in North America. So these two kind of superpowers of that time are battling over land and controlling their colonial possessions. And the colonists in these regions felt like they were concerned that this conflict was going to start to push further into especially their British territories, their areas where they were living. And so they decided they needed to come up with a way to kind of protect themselves and unify themselves early on, so that they figured we are better and stronger if we're more unified. Many of you have maybe seen that join or die image. It's commonly used even today in politics and different groups that look at unification. But back then, it was this concept that the snake cut in a bunch of different little parts is a dead snake. But a snake that is all connected and all one piece, like a united group of states, interesting, it would be more powerful and stronger together than apart. And people that were pushing for those ideas were colonists like you've all probably heard of Ben Franklin. And so Ben Franklin was one of the first to kind of draft a document that said we should try and unify and work together to protect ourselves, a document of what he called mutual defense. And this document would be an early forerunner or precursor to the later Constitution that would be drafted in 1776. And those types of ideas that a lot of these Enlightenment thinkers had presented started to kind of pop up and be incorporated in many of the writings of these founding fathers, people like Ben Franklin and James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, who were proponents of kind of these new political thoughts. So for the next bullet, we want to say that colonists like Benjamin Franklin, decided to draft a document of mutual defense, amongst the colonies, which would be a forerunner. The term forerunner is down there in the bottom part of the screen for you. It should be a forerunner to the U.S. Constitution. And then put a semicolon. And we want to say many of the political ideas of the Enlightenment would be incorporated into many of the founding fathers' writings, and serve as inspiration for the American Revolution. So a lot of the political ideas that were presented in the Enlightenment were going to be characteristics of the writing of this time, and are going to be the ideas that are going to push the colonists to rebel against the British government and want their independence, which will lead to the conflict we call the American Revolution, and what eventually starts our country as its own entity. So obviously really significant, these Enlightenment ideas to the beginning of our country and its significance. Also within this concept of the American Revolution, the Enlightenment is also going to inspire a revolution in France as well, which is what we're going to be talking about in our next unit. So we want to say for the last bullet, in France, Enlightenment ideas would serve as a major influence. For the events of the French Revolution. So we're also going to see that those ideas are going to influence France's revolution as well. So two revolutions that are sparked by these new political ideas. So now what we're going to do is a little activity where we are going to look at these ideas. So you want to bring your notes up to me with your checklist so I can check those off. And I will give you a green worksheet. And then you want to go onto Canvas and download the Enlightenment Thinkers Quotes page from Canvas. You can download that into Notability for yourself. So go ahead and pause the video for a second and complete those tasks. Now, if you are resuming the video, what we are going to do, you should have the quotes page downloaded. What we're going to do is I'm going to briefly explain to you what you're going to do with the quotes page and how you're going to use that for this activity. So the quotes page is going to look like this at the top, and it's going to have 11 different quotes on it. And these are quotes that are things that were part of founding documents of our history in the United States. So different little passages from important documents or founding fathers or individuals that shaped kind of our history and our nation. And what we're going to do is try and match those up to who was the person that inspired that idea, which Enlightenment thinker was the one that first presented this concept. So we're going to do number 1 together. So make sure you're kind of following along so you understand what you will be doing. So you'll look at each quote. So we'll start with number 1. So number 1 is a passage from the Declaration of Independence. And the passage says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." So that quote, then what you're doing is trying to figure out, what is it presenting? What idea is it presenting? So it's talking about, that there's a true belief that individuals should be all treated the same, and that as humans, as individuals, we are given certain rights. He calls them unalienable rights, meaning that they cannot be taken away, and that those rights include things like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So now what we're going to do is look back at our notes then, and we would try and figure out who presented an idea that is similar or inspirational to that particular quote. So I would look back at EQ3, as well as I can look at EQ4 and EQ5 to the different concepts that are presented there. And I'm scanning through, and I'm looking for something about rights that are guaranteed to us. So if I scan down and I come to John Locke, I see that we have in our notes that John Locke said a government's purpose is to protect people's natural rights to life, liberty, and property. That sounds very familiar to this passage. So that means that John Locke was probably the inspirational figure that came up and presented this idea that we used in our Declaration of Independence. So on my worksheet, in the grid next to number 1, the thinker, I'm going to write John Locke's name in that first box. And then I'm going to explain how I know it was John Locke. How do they match up? So I could say Locke said that a government's purpose was to protect people's natural rights to life, liberty, and property, which are similar to the natural rights proposed in the Declaration of Independence. So that's my reasoning. So I'm doing a couple different things here. I'm first reading the quote, trying to figure out what concept is it presenting, what is it that particular quote saying. I'm then going back through my notes and looking for an idea that's similar to that. So you might want to use your notes and the quotes page on like a split screen to look at both of those at the same time. Once I find someone who has that idea, then I'm going to write the person's name in that first box. And then I'm going to provide support, or what's my rationale for how those two concepts are similar. And I'm going to write that in the far right box. So that's what I'm looking for on this paper. And you'll do that with each of the quotes that you have here, all remaining 10 quotes. So that's what you're going to do then for this activity to wrap up section 2.